Hello, everyone. Dun da da da, dun da da da, dun da da da. The Kansas legislature finished. It finished in the early hours of Saturday over the weekend. And so now, here to wrap that up as best we can, given the time, here we are. My name's
That
Clay.
energy really fell off there from the beginning.
My name's Clay Wirestone. I'm the Kansas Reflector's opinion editor.
I'm Sherman Smith. I'm the editor-in-chief.
And so we're going to talk about what happened. So, Sherman, was I hallucinating or did the session end?
Yeah, the session did end, Clay. And it ends like it always does, with a lot of chaos, rampant bill bundling, and unnecessary, tedious, long days of unending votes that last into the overnight hours for 2 or 3 days straight.
Although to be fair, especially bad this year.
It's hard for me to compare to other years. It always seems bad and unnecessary. But they go out for long hours, and they come with what they call conference committee reports, where they've taken 3 or 4 or sometimes more pieces of legislation, thrown them all together in one. Sometimes you have 3 bills that people like and 1 bill that a bunch of people hate, but now they have to vote for it because the other 3 things are in there. And they do that over and over and over again. And some of these are the biggest items that they do all year. They were trying to find a way to deliver on their promises for property tax relief, and they had to pass a budget, which they didn't do until the penultimate night.
And that property tax bill as well was something that, I think that was the last thing, one of the last things.
Yeah, last thing. And as we've kind of talked about all year, none of these ideas actually are going to lower your property tax bill.
But going back a bit, let's talk about the budget first of all, because it is the thing that I've always talked about in these videos from the beginning, from January, was that the one thing that the Kansas legislature statutorily has to do every year is set a budget. And what's more, it has to set a balanced budget. In other words, the amount of money they get in and the amount of money they pay out, it's got to work out to either money left over or zero.
Yeah, this is a budget plan that'll actually get to zero in about 3 years, and only balances out because they're going to transfer money from the rainy day fund, hundreds of millions of dollars basically, to make this work. I was in a private meeting between the governor's budget director, Adam Proffitt, and Senate Democrats on Thursday, where he said this is the worst budget he had ever seen. So some of the highlights here, it does give a 1% raise to state employees in the executive branch. The governor had called for 2.5%. 1% feels like a slap in the face for a lot of state employees. The legislature, by the way, gave themselves a 4% raise and their staff a 10% raise, but then declared, Troy Waymaster, the budget director on the House side, representative from Bunker Hill, said, "I just don't believe in across-the-board pay raises." But they ended up with a 1% pay raise that agencies can then actually figure out who's going to get that raise. But the catch to that is the agencies still have to cut their budgets overall by 1.5%. So that 1% pay raise has got to come from somewhere else in the agency spending. That's one of the concerns with the budget. There are a lot of provisos left in there, little policy ideas that are attached to funding. We talked before a few weeks ago, they left in the ban on student protests, the walkouts at schools. The schools can be fined the equivalent of their superintendent's salary if they let students do this. There's big First Amendment implications here. There's a provision in there that's going to let some favored aviation companies in Wichita have a low interest loan from the state's Pooled Money Investments Board. And there's also some language banning DEI at all the universities. It withholds $2 million apiece from each of the universities until they come back and prove or declare in some way that they have gotten rid of all of DEI, as if anybody can define what that means. They've installed a couple of fiscal integrity auditor positions. This was an idea from Representative Christy Williams, a Republican from Augusta in the House. This is a bill that didn't get passed through both chambers, but it got stuck in as a proviso in the budget. the concern is the budget director, Adam Prophet, laid it out is these two positions, they're supposedly looking for fraud, waste, and abuse throughout the executive branches. One will report to the Senate president, one will report to the House Speaker. The problem is they're given total access to accounting and budget software. It's a cybersecurity threat. They would have access to social security numbers, to routing numbers for checking accounts. They would be able to identify undercover KBI agents. They would be able to, whether intentionally or accidentally, delete records from the budget or accounting software. Some of the other things, the Republicans like to say that they came in $60 million less than what the governor was proposing to spend, but they get there by cutting $20 million from state employee salaries. They cut, I think it was another $45 million from special education funding for schools and another $25 million in staffing for state hospitals. So really they're cutting a lot of things that people would say are things that should be in the budget to say that they came in under while they larded up with a bunch of special provisions for other things.
Well, there's a couple of points I want to dig into here, Sherman. So one of them, and the first one being that when we're talking about the numbers here, this is something I saw back when I lived and worked in New Hampshire for a decade or so. And every year you'd have what was called town meeting, where all of the residents of a town, usually it was a smaller town, would come together and talk about the budget for the next year. And of course, the thing is, even in a small town, the budget was often, multiple millions of dollars, right? So it's big numbers. And what people would fight about or spend the most time talking about during those town meetings would be, $5,000 for a truck, or like, repairs of some sort. And then, meanwhile, you have this question of, it's like, oh, we're adding 10 million here, or we're subtracting $1 million there, and, nobody talks about that. And I think what you really see when you're talking about this budget, like we're talking, like 1.5% cuts across all of these executive agencies, like that's I don't think it's broken out that we have the precise number, but that's a lot of change. That's a lot of money. Likewise, this money from the state hospitals, I think there was some money from K through 12 mental health spending as well,
went from 16 to 10 million.
And so we're talking about these cuts. These are huge cuts, and you talk about things that people had hours-long debates about, and they were, 1 million or 2 million. And we have this budget where we're talking about tens of millions of dollars of cuts, of additions in some cases, but often cuts, no discussion at all, or just like a sentence or two of discussion.
Yeah, you end up with negotiators, 2 Republicans from both the House and Senate, along with 1 Democrat from the House and Senate. So 6 people in total are negotiating all of these changes at the last second. They're really just doing the bidding of leadership and powerful lobbying interests. Even Republicans on the Senate floor called this out. So, I'm tired of voting for budgets where we stick all these things in to satisfy lobbyists at the end. This is all done in the dark of night with very little transparency. And then it comes out to the floor. There's no chance to amend what they call a conference committee report that comes out of this. It's just an up or down vote. And, I think the vote totals on this really reflect how bad the budget is. A lot of these bills, every Republican will fall in line behind it. These both very, very narrowly pass both the Senate and the House on the budget.
And, and I think just reflecting some real widespread discontent, not just with what's in the bills, but how the whole process was handled.
Yeah.
The other piece I wanted to talk about, though, is this is really where, and apologies if I'm getting a little ahead of ourselves here, but it's true. This is where Governor Laura Kelly, she really then begins to wield a lot of power in this process. And she's always had it, but when the budget comes in, she can veto the whole thing. That's probably not likely for the reason of...
Yeah, the danger if you veto the budget in its entirety is that they could muster the votes. It becomes a us versus her kind of thing for Republicans. If they muster the votes to override the veto, the entirety of that budget stays in place. Instead, she could come in and do what's called a line item veto and strike any provision from the budget that she doesn't like or doesn't want and force them to vote on each one of those things separately. I think it's separate in the House. I think that sometimes they bundle those in the Senate, but either way, she could force them to fight over each one of these little things, and possibly even tell them, pass a supplemental budget when they come back April 9th and 10th.
And again, it's so much of this has to do with the fact that at least in the House we had a wholesale rebellion, basically, of a bunch of Republican House members this last week and the week before that kind of forced House Speaker Dan Hawkins to allow a PBM bill, a pharmacy. I mean, this is another thing that happened this last week.
Seems like an eternity ago. Pharmacy benefit management bill, where they're trying to really rein in the middlemen who are causing the cost of drugs to skyrocket.
Well, depending on who you ask, the PBMs themselves would vigorously dispute this. But yes, but there were a couple of different drug pricing measures. Hawkins was attempting, from all appearances, to block both of them after this rebellion. One of them was indeed allowed to come to the floor and passed pretty handily through both chambers.
Yeah, Hawkins, whose career is built on the insurance side of this, has a lot of interest in not letting these things go through, did allow one to go through at the behest of other Republicans. It passed with almost unanimous support. I think a dozen or so people voted against it in the House.
Well, and in the Senate. And interestingly enough, I wrote about this within the last week. Hawkins on the House side voted against it, and Masterson on the Senate side voted against it. One of those rare cases where you see these big margins for these bills, and the leadership in each chamber voted no.
Yeah, and I think it kind of set the tone for this last week, at least on the House side, where things got increasingly, bitter and chippy. By the time we got to Friday, we had repeated admonishments from Blake Carpenter. Representative Blake Carpenter was presiding over the session, having to tell people to stop heckling, to maintain order, stop complaining about the bell ringing.
Well, and it's really just part of this feeling, at least that I had in these last few days, that while Dan Hawkins is still officially Speaker of the House, he really was kind of Speaker in name only for much of this last week.
Yeah, I think there's a growing realization that because he is running for State Insurance Commissioner, this is his final session in the House. The committee meetings are all over. He can't strip people of their committee chair or committee positions. And so I think there's a growing realization that he didn't have a lot of leverage hanging over them.
So this is what we had, obviously at Kansas Reflector last week, and the week before, we, Sherman and our reporters were writing 6 to 8 stories a day, putting out a tremendous amount of content. That's going to continue for this week because we've got to catch up. Like, we haven't even necessarily written stories about all of these things yet because we have only so many people and there's so much news.
Yeah, we wrote about so many things, and just a shout out, of course, to our reporters, senior reporters Tim Carpenter and Morgan Shilson, reporter Anna Kaminsky, also freelance reporters out there, Grace Hills and Maya Smith. Everybody worked really hard to cover this session down the stretch. I don't know that we have time to get into all of this, but there were bills dealing with overhauling the state nursing board and voiding disciplinary actions over 20 years. A massive bundle of bills that would rewrite the way elections work in some problematic ways if you care about voting rights. There's a World Cup bill that would basically open the door to 24/7 drinking, 23 hours a day. You could sell and buy liquor at restaurants, liquor stores, bars, wherever, and then also easing the rules to make it easier for everybody to basically open up your homes to people who want to rent a place to stay, opening up those rules, but also tying a transient guest tax to it so the state can make some revenue. There was talk of people who might be willing to come in and watch the World Cup, even willing to pay upwards of $15,000 a week for a place to stay, which seems a little crazy to me, but we'll see what happens.
Well, you've got a house right here, Sherman. Who knows how many World Cup players you could host.
There were a couple other things in there. The Taiwan ambassador came to the House and gave a big speech. The Kansas Supreme Court issued a big decision in this ongoing fight between the governor and the attorney general. Both sides declared victory. They dismissed the governor's lawsuit, so the attorney general declared victory, but they dismissed it because she was right. So she declared victory and all of that. And I mentioned the bell ringing earlier. They did override a couple of the governor's vetoes on bills that were not maybe the most consequential things in the world. The first time they did it, though, there was a bell ringing in the hallway right outside the House. And this had happened earlier in the session when they overrode the veto on the anti-trans bill. Democrats were furious about this. They went down to address the chamber, demanded an investigation, demanded answers. We were able to obtain video of the culprit. It was
Senate President Ty Masterson, who actually did seem to have a bit of an issue with figuring out how to ring the bell.
Yeah, it was not the most authoritative bell ringing I've ever seen. We have the
Also,
video.
why is that bell even there?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I mean, it's really just like, you kind of flip it and it also kind of raised the question of like, do we really care about such a tiny ring?
I
maybe
mean,
it sounds louder there.
some people do.
Yeah.
Tempers were flaring. Let's
Yeah.
put it that way.
So that's how the session, when you have this situation where everything gets passed in the final 2 or 3 days, long days, a lot of things bundled together that people don't like, and the big ticket items like the budget changing behind closed doors in the dark of night, these kind of tensions flare up.
Well, and I mean, this is certainly my impression. Since I returned to Kansas in the summer of 2016, this is my 10th session that I've been through. I think every session has seemed at the time worse than the one before. This one is no different than that. I heard a lot of unhappiness. I think we did just more broadly from, advocates, people who follow it, lawmakers, other journalists. Like I mean, people who follow this do see this, right? Like it's not that we're just these isolated voices in the wilderness about this. This is widely understood that things are not ideal at this stage.
I mean, we also hear from people who are just upset because they want to follow it, and it's such an intentionally bewildering process that it's difficult for them to find out what's going on, when things are going to happen.
Well, and as you often say, too, I mean, Republicans have the votes to pass whatever they want to do. If Republicans wanted to pass a budget that spent no money on Kansas and just sent gigantic checks to the Koch empire every month, they could do that. The issue is not the numbers. The issue is just, do you have a process that allows people, as you head towards whatever the outcome is, a say in what the process is? Just to say, I don't agree with this.
Yeah, I think we'll talk more about some process issues in the coming weeks, but the point is that they could be transparent about the legislation that they're going to debate before they come in and have a hearing, allow the public to come in and say whatever they want to say about it, have a full, robust debate on the floor in both chambers, and still pass the
And
same
not
bills.
take emergency action,
Yeah.
actually take the full 2 days to vote on everything.
Yeah, no emergency action, no calling the question, other issues where they silence debate because, they want to be able to pass these things, but they don't want anybody to tell them that what they're doing is bad or wrong or insufficient. But they could let people stand up and say whatever they wanted to say, and they could still pass everything they wanted because they have the numbers. They choose not to.
So just quickly here, since we've spent so much time, there is, so we have 2 weeks now, basically. There's a 2-week gap between the end of the session proper, and there's legislators are supposed to return on April 9th and 10th for a veto session. They may then return even later for sine die, which is the official last day of the session, or that might be April 10th. It depends. Depends on how much they want to do. But this upcoming week, Sherman, this week ahead, very end of March, several days of April, what's going on?
Yeah, between now and the start of that veto session, of course, we'll have the governor signing bills or vetoing bills left and right. Sometimes it's every day that you get one or two more announcements from the governor's office. Sometimes there's a gap in there, but we'll be tracking all of that. Also, there's some interim committee meetings. This is where they'll get together. It's just sort of like the regular committee meetings during the session, except they're not considering legislation. They don't have the authority to pass legislation now because they're not actually in session. But they can talk about ideas, they can gather input from folks, they can bring people in, like agency leaders to give speeches or testify. They could bring in contractors. So Monday, they have a foster care oversight committee, which will meet off and on over the next 9 months till the end of the year. Typically, they'll get updates from the Department for Children and Families, as well as all the foster care providers, the contractors that are out there. But there's a new rule change starting now. We've gotten some correspondence from people who have signed up to testify. They're being notified. The new rule is you can only testify once a year. People are upset about this because they feel like if you're not going to actually fix the problems, they should be allowed to come back and complain that the problems are still there.
And there you have it. In terms of our videos about this session, this video series will pause along with the legislature, but we will be back with at least one more after the veto session. And we invite you, as always, to sign up for our daily newsletter at kansasreflector.com/subscribe. That's kansasreflector.com/subscribe. It's our daily digest of news and commentary from Kansas, Topeka, and elsewhere. Sherman, anything else to add?
I just like to remind people that the newsletter is free, all of our stories are free to read, and there's no advertising.
So anyway, thanks for being with us on this voyage, and we will see you. My name's Clay Wirestone.
I'm Sherman Smith.
Take care.